As many of you know, I have a second master's degree, divinity, yes, but I also have one in theology with heavy emphasis in studies in art and religion. I've always been impressed and interested in the power of symbols in religious orientation. Lotus imagery is potent. It's one of my favorites. And just as an aside here before I go on, I'm going to tell you where imagery began to sink into my psyche. I was in a Methodist church growing up, and this preacher came with a black piece of paper. And as he was talking about the love of Jesus, he began drawing with chalk. And as he was drawing and as he was talking, this image of Jesus emerged, and his preaching was about the love of Jesus. It was so powerful. Man, I never paid attention on a Sunday morning. I was making things with a bulletin. I was wiggling. I was nudging my friends. But when he did that, everything stopped. The difference is, I also, and I'm going to say this because I know some in this room experienced abuse in childhood. I am a survivor of childhood abuse. And at the time, I remember thinking, Jesus will come and help me. And then, just for me, not for everyone, for me, there was a disconnect. I never did, I never could grasp the idea of Father and that kind of thing, though I still say that Jesus, his teachings about how we treat one another and how we should love and build the world that we dream about, that still resonates for me. So, the lotus flower. In my college years, I began studying Buddhism in my 20s, in my 30s, before I even went to divinity school to become a minister. And Buddhism had a great deal of importance to me. The lotus flower is one of the most ancient and deepest symbols found in Buddhism. Buddha is often depicted as sitting in the center of a lotus blossom. We have lotus out in the pond. It won't be long and you'll see the lotus come up, and the blossoms are powerful. The lotus symbolizes the rise from suffering. The roots of the plant dwell in the muck and mud, and the stem grows through the murky water of the pond and emerges with a beautiful blossom, opening toward the sun, above the surface of the water, above all the hardship and the murkiness and the dirty water and the mud. Now notice, it never leaves the water. It still has roots in suffering, but you're able to rise above suffering. The pattern of growth signifies the progress of the soul from the primeval mud of materialism through the waters of experience and into the bright sunshine of enlightenment. For a struggling individual, and honestly, who hasn't struggled at some time or other? Imagery of the lotus blossom climbing its way out of the mud through the ugliness, the hurt, the strife, the murky confusion of cloudy perceptions, and finally emerging to find that blue, brilliant sky. It has the capacity to be a symbol for the human, for our experiences. For Buddhist, meditation assists the achievement of becoming a blossom, of rising above the muck of daily life, also in order to experience joy and bliss. Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese monk, Zen master, poet, and peace activist, was extremely successful in helping people to experience more joy through meditation. In fact, when people entered a retreat center where Thich Nhat Hanh taught, he had them put their hands together like this and greet one another and say, "For you, a lotus, for you, a Buddha to be." I'm going to ask you right now for two reasons. One, because I don't want any snoring in here this morning. And two, because watch what happens. Would you stand up, put your hands in the position of a lotus blossom, and I want you to bow to somebody, anybody, and say, for you, a lotus, a Buddha to be. Thank you. Every person I lay my eyes on, you may sit down, you were smiling. I don't know if you're smiling, this is ridiculous, or it's great to connect with somebody else and to wish them well. So in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha had a sermon, and this is all it was. Said not a word, simply held up a flower and gazed at it. After some time, one monk stood up. Makshyapa began to smile. He was the only monk who understood. Not one word was spoken, and yet the monk got it. Yogic lore has used flower symbolism extensively. The human spine is likened to the stem, and the brain to its flower. The stem requires painstaking and unfaltering care, without which the flowering of the mind would be impossible. There are also milestones on the path. If you do yoga, you'll recognize what I'm saying about the chakras, the energy centers. And this is old Hindu lore before Buddhism. So there is one chakra, and it's on the crown, and it's considered the lotus chakra. It's at the top of your head. The entire spiritual journey is mapped out in terms of floral imagery, the chakras going up the spine. The ultimate goal, or the zenith of the spiritual process, is described in a well-known image as the flowering of human consciousness, the unfurling of that crown chakra, also known as the 1,000-petaled lotus. For newcomers who must be wondering, it is a common practice here in our Unitarian Universalist gathering places to learn something. We come ready to glean a little wisdom from Western and Eastern traditions. We all may identify as Unitarian Universalists, but personally we each may have a differing personal practice to support our search for inspiration, to help us in our ethical and our spiritual lives, centered on love. We are committed to our communities of pluralism, meaning you get to be you. You don't have to change to be a part of this congregation. All we do is centered on love. As you have already noted this morning, I want to explore various aspects of Buddhism, including lotus imagery. However, before going further, I want to emphasize a couple of points. First, when we speak of Western religions, it's philosophy-focused. The scriptures say, "Thus says the Lord." We read in sacred texts in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Someone is telling people how to conduct their lives, how to conduct our lives, which might be helpful and really, really strong and relevant for some. Eastern traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, that emerged from the Hindu tradition. Remember, Hinduism was there, and then Buddhism emerged. It tends to be focused on inner wisdom. The Buddha provides suggestions, but ultimately one derives instructions from that lamp within. In Eastern texts, we often read words such as, "I have meditated and reflected, and this insight has come to me." Although countless people do it, there's really no point in arguing which tradition is better than another. I don't have to tell you all that. I know that. I know you all know that. The question one must ask is, which understanding is more helpful? We ask ourselves, which is more helpful for me as I travel this earthly existence in a physical body that is having a spiritual experience? A reminder, the root word for, or the root meaning for the spirit is wind, or breath, meaning we running around in physical bodies, breathing, trying to make sense of our lives. Buddhism is a system of belief that emerged in India sometime in the 6th century before the Common Era. Although exact year is still unknown, it's disputed. The original faith heritage during the birth of Buddhism was what we in modern times label as Hinduism. It appeared in India and spread to East Asia, where it interacted, and this is so important, where it interacted with indigenous belief systems that we recognize as Confucianism in China and Shintoism in Japan. But a common element in all traditions that influence Buddhism is a universal appeal and an understanding of the human experience. Eastern traditions tend to offer guidance for how to live a more meaningful or meaning-filled life, rather than to create demands. The Dalai Lama's brother, I lived in Bloomington, Indiana for many years. Hence, the Dalai Lama would come visit his brother who lived in a monastery outside of Bloomington, Indiana. And when the Dalai Lama came, he would do workshops and teachings. I attended a couple of those workshops, and there were two things I loved and I still love about the Dalai Lama. One, he has an amazing sense of humor. And I love this one. He says before his Dharma talks, practice the tradition of your youth. If it no longer works for you, I can share some information that's helpful to me. I love that. Nobody's walking around saying you're going to go to hell if you don't believe this. It is an invitation. It is not a demand. Just a side note, he did talk about killing living things. And he said, now a cat loves you. A cat purrs and snuggles up to you. A mosquito, he did that. Again, his sense of humor is out of this world. Buddhism offers answers to the big questions in life, just like other traditions. For example, since Buddhism emerged from a culture heavily steeped in Hinduism, some of Hinduism's concepts still exist, such as sometimes references to gods and goddesses, and sometimes, often, the idea of reincarnation, that we are existing in this life, and when we die, we come back in a different life. As I speak of aspects of Buddhism, I want to remind you this too. Like Christianity and Protestant traditions, they're both Christian, but they're different flavors of Christianity, right? So true. It is also true with Buddhism. There are different forms, flavors. Theravada, the earliest form. Mahayana, Vajrayana, the most recent form. And Zen is part of that last form of Buddhism. I'm offering general facets of a very complex religious system or spirituality this morning. But what has been helpful for me are some very basic concepts. So maybe many of you know who was the earliest proponent of Buddhism. The earliest disciples, there were people who were Buddhist along the Ganges River, which was known as the Middle Region or the Rose Apple Continent, that even today in the markets they have the rose apple that smells. It's a tropical fruit that smells like a rose. One of the disciples who put their trust in personal efforts to live and walk on a spiritual path rather than to depend upon the saving grace of gods and goddesses was a man from a small, wealthy kingdom in what is regarded today as southern Nepal. He was from the Sakya clan. Today, when people speak his name, they call him Sakyamuni, enlightened one from the Sakya people. However, his name at birth was Siddhartha Gautama. All of his life, Siddhartha, his father, was a king, tried to protect his child from experiencing or witnessing any suffering. Now, as most parents know, some of the hardest parts of being a parent is watching your kids suffer. So I kind of understand the king's impulse. But when the child grew, he got outside of his living quarters, and he rode around the kingdom, and he found sickness, and he found death. And he had a revelation. He realized that he too was mortal. A few years later, the young man left his wife, his child, his family, his wealth, and his father's kingdom. He set out on a path of enlightenment, a path that would give him the tools to ease suffering, both for himself and for others, perhaps. Siddhartha grew, became a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is one who takes vows to remain on the path toward enlightenment, more importantly, to help others. He sought and found numerous wise teachers, and eventually Siddhartha became Sakyamuni after his experience of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. A foundational teaching in Buddhism instructs one to focus. For those of you who have been practicing Buddhist, you know this, the 3 gems, or the 3 jewels. The Buddha is the first gem, often seated in a lotus. The second one invites that we take refuge in the teachings of the Dharma. In classical Indian culture, Dharma pertains to sense of social and moral obligation. Some Buddhist texts imply that Dharma is equivalent for law, but Buddhist usage of the word Dharma reflects to that which holds. So in English, it has been often interpreted in our country, in England, as teachings that are firm, meaning they don't change. Using the teachings, the Buddha offers insights for how things are, and then designs a program, a system, a way of doing things that help people to adjust their attitudes and actions. Some Buddhist teachers use medical imagery, suggesting that the 4 Noble Truths diagnose the human predicament, and the Eightfold Path is the prescribed therapy. So I kind of jumped forward. First gem, Buddha in the lotus, who shared teachings, the Dharma, information that's helpful. And the third one instructs that one take refuge in the Sangha. That is the community. It has been pronounced Sangha or Sangha, and both are correct. The Sangha is a community of ordained and lay Buddhists. The community is very important. In fact, originally the teachings of the Buddha, they were oral, like so many other traditions. And then around the 1st century Common Era, there was a terrible sickness, and a lot of the bhikkhus, those who were ordained, died, and so they decided they needed to write down a lot of the Dharma, the teachings. So the Theravada monks in Sri Lanka wrote the stories down. The scriptures are collected, and they're called a Tripitaka, or in 3 baskets. The collection survives in the Pali language, a vernacular related to and partly derived from the Sanskrit language. So the scriptures are often referred to as the Pali Canon. So that's a lot of information. I'm going to stop, and we're going to step back and just recap. In Buddhism, we find the 4 Noble Truths. This sounds so simple, doesn't it? Listen to this. There is suffering, duh. There is a reason for suffering, duh. There is a way out of suffering. The 4 Noble, or the Eightfold Path helps one out of suffering. So the more you think about that, those 4 Noble Truths are foundational. Now, I have to say, I mentioned in my early growing up years, I couldn't understand what I was doing wrong that was causing suffering for me. And then later on, I realized, wait, this idea that suffering exists takes the personal out of it. Why do bad things happen? Because that's suffering. It exists. But there are ways. Can you show the Eightfold Path, Jeremy? So many of us in the Western reigns, the Western continent, say, I don't really like right view, because that implies there's a wrong view. But the word in this translation means skilled view, skilled intentions, skilled speech, skilled action, skilled livelihood, skilled effort, skilled concentration, skilled mindfulness. Do you see that it will take your whole life to practice Buddhism, because we're never ultimately there, but these help us. I'll give you an example of suffering. I have had, and maybe some of you will grin and recognize this impulse, I've had a number of times a woman say to me, I gave my grandson a gift at Christmas, and it just hurts me so that he never sent a thank you letter. Sound true, right? So you're sitting around going, well, why doesn't my grandson care about me? He doesn't send a thank you note. Well, stop. Maybe the perception is, did you give that to the son? Was your intention to give that gift to the son to get a thank you? Well, no. So go back to your skilled intention. You gave it to him out of love. Oh. So the suffering eases by you sitting around saying, what's the matter? It's more about, let me remind myself I did this out of love. The Eightfold Path invites an individual to reconsider one's perceptions and to develop skills, perceptions, and actions that lessen suffering. The other suffering about when you say, this person did this to me, I'm so angry, the compassion comes to the right, let's see, how shall we do this? Concentration. If I think about this from many sides, if I concentrated on why this person did this, I might have learned that it wasn't about me. It was about that person who cut in front of me on 19. You all were talking about 19 earlier, right? How many times you said, that stupid SOB, right? So, maybe that person didn't see you. It's not about being, they're there to hurt you. It's about they're clueless. So we have compassion for people because maybe at some time or other we have cut people off unknowingly. So the compassion comes out. So through focused meditation, this is a key part. By practicing meditation, one will likely become calmer, less agitated, less judgmental, and more compassionate to oneself and to others. There are several people in this room. Would you raise your hand if you have been to the Tuesday night exhale meditation here in this room? You have. They've done it on Zoom before. These two. Anybody else? Yes. So we know that the longer you do this, the longer you meditate, it doesn't have to be just with a group of people. It can be any time during the day. It can be 3 minutes. It can be 1 minute. It can be 20 minutes or 40. The more practice you do to meditate, and if it helps to sing the song that we sang earlier, to calm ourselves and to help us send a little calmness out into a very hurting world that seems bent on chaos. So you're welcome to come. It's 6 to 7 on Tuesday nights. Those of you on Zoom, I know some of you have done that. I know that you're one of them. Ned comes to Christina, right? Ned does that too. So here's the thing. There are some things about my Methodist upbringing that I still embrace, and it's the value of community. I know how powerful it is to be among people who genuinely care about you and your family. However, the older I got, the more I realized that the tradition of my youth wasn't working for me. I am Unitarian Universalist first and foremost. My theology is one of covenant, one of promise. My existence, my promise to myself and to others is to be of service. And that makes me part of that line of Unitarian Universalism. I believe in inclusivity. All of these values that you see in this floral imagery right here. They're all first and foremost important to me. And yet, on a personal basis, teachings from Eastern traditions have helped me very much for me. The Buddha taught everything changes. Through all these changes, one can lessen one's suffering by engaging in recognizing the gifts of the present moment. We see it in yoga. We see it in Buddhist meditation, to come back to the present moment instead of staying fixed on what happened 20 years ago or what will happen next year, staying focused on the present moment, listening to the silence, hearing other people breathing in the room with you, staying focused on the present moment. As someone said recently, it's really hard for me to watch my loved ones suffer. And I said, always find the gift of the present moment. And he said, that's really hard to do. It's a practice, isn't it? Yes. Yes. May this be your practice to notice the gift of the present moment, no matter what happens, what happened then, what happens in the future. I'm so grateful for our Unitarian Universalist tradition that encourages the journey that is spiritual. I invite you to participate in deeper study always. May it be so, and amen.